My name is Sunny Rucker-Chang. I am an assistant professor in German studies, and I'm also the director of the European Studies program here at University of Cincinnati. And I'm really just here to welcome you to Cincinnati, welcome you to the University of Cincinnati. I'm really looking forward to the panels that are going to happen today, as well as the dialogues that are going to come as a result. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors. There are many, and they are all in the program if you would like to look at them for reference. Really small detail that I was asked to make sure everyone knows: the restrooms are just down this way, just in case you're looking for them. And finally, I'd like to introduce Dean David Stradling, Associate Dean for Humanities, and Zane Miller, Professor of Urban History, who will give our opening remarks. So thank you, David.
Good morning. Let me begin by drawing your attention to two things in your program. One is a message from Verna Williams, who is the interim Dean of the College of Law, who has welcomed you with a lovely letter. She wishes she could be here, but she cannot. And the second thing that I would draw your attention to is the very last red page, which is the Conference Planning Committee. And just as a way of recognizing how much work it is to put together an event like this, countless hours, thankless hours of doing things, communicating, and making certain that people have safe travels here, organizing food and whatnot. And at an institution like the University of Cincinnati, we all know that is work that falls upon the faculty themselves. We don't have legions of staff helping us out. So in particular, Sunny, thank you for having me here to welcome everybody. So the last thing that I'd like to do is in fact, thank all of the participants for coming, some of you from a great distance. This is, I think, an essential conversation that we're about to have. I have had the great pleasure this semester of teaching a course called Race and Ethnicity in Global Cities, which was a surprise to me. It was not a class that I created. It wasn't a class that I was expecting to teach. A colleague got sick and I took it over for her. And the central text in that class is my selection. I'm an urban historian by training, so I selected Carl Nightingale's book on segregation. It's a global history of divided cities. The most striking thing about that book for me is the way in which Nightingale bounces between, at one point, the story of apartheid Johannesburg and Soweto, and Chicago and the South Side. It's striking because Americans hardly ever think about their own racism, their own racist past in relationship to other parts of the world, and in particular not in relationship to what I was taught in the 1980s as being an anomaly, the most archaic and abusive system of segregation that the world had ever seen, and something that we were activists against in the 1980s. I was thinking that my students would have the same reaction. Right, that they would see American racism in connection with the racism that existed around the world, and in particular apartheid. But of course, that's not what they were struck by. They did not grow up in the 1980s. They didn't know anything about apartheid. They were struck by all of it. They were struck by the entirety of the book, the way in which racism has a deep and global past. And what I got from them was a real sense, not just of devastation in this recognition, but also of urgency. That they felt this urgency every day that we had these conversations about racism, that something, even though this is a long and intractable problem, that's something that needed to be solved now in their lifetimes. They expressed it quite regularly. I entered the class with a great deal of trepidation, not just because I'm a white man teaching about race and ethnicity before a mixed race group, and feeling a little out of my depths because I'm an American historian teaching about cities around the world. But because we're living in the era of Trump, and these topics are especially fraught, of course. And so I issued my usual caveat about being gracious listeners and being patient with each other and accepting of different opinions. And I must say the students surprised me by taking this up as if it were natural. I have left this class feeling hopeful about the future, as they do, about being able to solve these problems that they have been reading about. At one point, in one of the nicer moments in my career, I think, one of my students, during one of our conversations, just blurted out, "This is what college is for." Right? To be in a mixed group, mixed race, mixed class setting, and to be perfectly comfortable talking about very difficult issues struck me as exactly what college is for. And I would say the same of this, right? This is exactly what universities are for, to gather people together who are experts from different fields, to talk about intractable problems, and to work on solutions. So I wish you a wonderful day. I've already apologized that I have to leave and go do email, because that's what administrators do. But I hope that you have lovely conversations, and congratulations on
My name is Emily Ho, and I am on the faculty at the College of Law here at University of Cincinnati, where I co-direct the Center for Race, Social Justice, Race, Gender, and Social Justice. I've said this so many times, and with my good friends and colleagues, Kristen Calsom, who's sitting right here, and also Professor Janet Moore, who was here, but I don't. There she is. Hi, Janet. And I want to thank Sunny and Felix. He's also a colleague of ours at the College of Law, Felix Chang, for all their work, as well as our wonderful staff, Jenny Edelstein, and our students, Katie Gaines. Katie has been a rock star through all of this, so thank you. As well, we have a whole bunch of students here. Okay, so rather than, I'm not going to individually read the biographies of the panelists because they're in the program, and also it really takes up a lot of time. But Matthias Moschel is at the far end there. Did I say your name right?
Yeah.
And then Cengiz.
Yeah, perfect.
Cengiz,
Yeah.
what's your last name?
Barcelona.
Very.
Very.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Faster?
You know, I mean, rather than crazily mess it up, I'm just gonna, I apologize.
Just very phonetically, Barskanmas.
Barskanmas. Okay, great, thank you. And Deborah Thompson. And I'm Emily Ho. It's like Ho, H-O. So the way that we're going to proceed is I'm going to start out with some framing comments and sort of introductory comments about both critical race theory and racial formation. Given that the title of the panel is Critical Race Theory and Racial Formation, these are two major sort of theoretical ideas, and so I'm going to give some introductory remarks about those before we turn to the panelists. Each of them will speak for about 15 to 17 to 20 minutes. And so we have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. And the order is going to be actually Deborah will start, and then Matthias, and then Cengiz, right? So, okay, so let me begin by some framing around critical race theory and racial formation. So many in the room probably may already know all of this, and if you do, forgive me, please just be patient. For others who aren't so familiar, so critical race theory is a scholarly movement that grew out of the dissatisfaction in the American Legal Academy with the critical legal studies movement that was burgeoning in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And they were a group of mostly, elite law professors, white male law professors at elite law schools, sort of critiquing the law from its very root, as the sort of structure of the law, borrowing very heavily from the legal realists of the earlier 20th century, a group of scholars of color, minority scholars, basically critiqued the the crits, I'll call them, for their failure to attend to the centrality of race in CLS's otherwise very compelling critiques of law and legal structures. There's a lot of origin stories and great history sort of written in, so I don't want to talk too much about that, but I do want to mention some sort of central characteristics of critical race theory, one of which is their challenging of the notion that the law both in content and in application, is objective. And their claim, in addition to that, that the law plays a very key role in constructing race as a socio-political category. And the sort of contestation of objectivity is something that's in line with the critiques of the critical legal studies movement. The race crits, and I'm also, caveat, going to be missing some of the things that other people think are, that many of us think are central tenets, but they also challenge the liberal notion, especially in the years following the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and through the continuing backlash to the gains of that era, that race is normatively irrelevant. And they also challenge the sort of postmodern critique or claim that race, while socially constructed, though socially constructed, is non-existent, right? So they're challenging, not sort of just the typical suspects, the sort of conservative right, but also liberals and postmodernists. So race crits advance the claim that social constructionism does not make race either irrelevant or non-existent, right? So just because race is socially constructed doesn't mean that it doesn't mean anything. In fact, it means that it means a lot. A lot of the work of critical race theorists is to really expose the way that race has functioned, mostly in the US, but also globally. Many of the people in the room are doing this work globally, is to challenge the way race has functioned in the allocation, accumulation, and exploitation of resources. In the really wonderful anthology, Critical Race Theory, Key Writings That Form the Movement, that's edited by Kim Crenshaw and Kendall Thomas and Gary Peller, and who am I leaving?
Richard Delgado.
Who?
Richard Delgado.
No. Who am I? Kim and Neil Gatanda. Thank you very much. Gosh. In the introduction to that book, which is again, it's sort of an origin narrative of the emergence of critical race theory, she writes, "We understood," she, as one of the sort of founding members of the movement, or she and her colleagues write, "We understood our project as an effort to construct a race-conscious and at the same time anti-essentialist account of the processes by which law participates in racing American society." Now, that was back in the 1980s, and so now I'm going to skip way ahead to now, the Trump era, which is, for those not from the U.S. in the room, is actually probably not a huge surprise given the sort of trends, the trending of sort of nationalism and the far right across the world. And one of the actually most important new developments and theoretical strands in critical race theory, in my opinion, is actually Sumi Cho's post-racialism, theory of post-racialism. And I was delighted when I found out that Sumi Cho, who's sitting right here, coming to the conference. So Sumi's theory of post-racialism, she wrote this piece, Post-Racialism, right after President Obama was elected the first time. So I think, the piece came out in 2009, right? And it is a theory that's distinct from, so it's definitely within sort of critical race theory, but it's distinct from the line, the theory of colorblindness, or the ideology of colorblindness, which really capitalized on the sort of race is irrelevant, if you see race, you're racist, right? Which is sort of what I think we've been living under since at least the early 1980s or the late 1970s. And so this work draws on the foundational work of Omi and Wana, who are sort of the originators of racial formation theory, which is the second part of the title of this panel, and they're sociologists. And Sumi characterizes post-racialism as a racial project, which is something that they sort of conceived of. That is, as a project that organizes the distribution of resources by the state according to racialized categories. Okay, And so, according to Cho, to Sumi, post-racialism does this, that the work that post-racialism does, the effect of post-racialism, is it affects essentially a three-pronged retreat from race. A material retreat from race in terms of racial remedies, right? A sort of cultural or discursive retreat that allows, and I'm quoting here, allows whites to oppose civil rights remedies and advocate for race-neutral policies because society, vis-a-vis Obama's election in 2008, has transcended the racial moment or the civil rights era. And then also the political retreat, a political retreat from race, which sort of manifests in rhetoric of false universalism, in the sort of populist demands for equality, and in this kind of trope of unification. And the way in which post-racialism, according to Sumi, differs from colorblindness is that it's aimed at a new audience of sort of liberal whites in particular, where where colorblindness has been sort of exposed as a neoconservative project, right? That post-racialism is sort of aimed at this audience of white liberals who are suffering from what Darren Hutchinson calls racial exhaustion, right? We're just so tired of having to keep talking about race. So, as you can imagine, there's a lot of potential here for interest convergence, right? As Derek Bell originally conceived that, and I think we've seen many instances of interest convergence. And so, I want to stop there because I think, well, I'm the moderator, I don't want to talk too long, but I think that there's so many points at which post-racialism and critical race theory, there's so many points in which all of the papers kind of speak to these issues. And so I'm going to shut up now, and I'm going to turn things over to Deborah.
Great, thank you. I'm going to stand up here because I have a PowerPoint. And
Can everyone see the PowerPoint?
you see?
Is it too late?
Great, thanks everyone. Thanks to the conference organizers for having me. I'm really happy to be the first speaker on the first panel because you have all had coffee. And most importantly, because it gives me the opportunity to recognize that the University of Cincinnati sits on the traditional territory of the Shawnee people. I'm from the University of Oregon. That sits on the traditional territory of the Kalapuya people. This is a conference on race, and critical race theory often does not take account of settler colonialism, which combines racism with the violent dispossession of indigenous lands and the eradication of indigenous cultures. So let's just start on that great note. So for me, the fundamental question of this conference is, given that critical race theory and racial formations were theories largely developed by and for the American context, do these frameworks work in comparative, transnational, or global context? How transportable are these frameworks across time and space? And I think we actually already have some really excellent interventions. I don't know where to point this. Can you make it go? Thank you. I'm just gonna shout next slide. We have some excellent interventions that do precisely this. So Melissa Weiner considers how we might conceive of a global critical race theory, even though there are the really important national differences between racism and the ways in which societies interpret racial projects. There are several indicators of racialization that scholars can use to determine how racialization manifests in different locations, even as they're mutually interlocking and reinforcing. So for example, citizenship laws, criminalization. Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, me too. Wait. Yeah, awesome. Okay. Criminalization, right, which groups are most closely targeted, surveilled, and policed. Socioeconomic status, right, the unequal access to power and resources that structure a group's opportunities, daily interactions, right? So these are indicators that we can conceivably take and then use to compare different contexts. As well, people have used Omi and Winant's original theory of racial formations and applied them to comparative and sometimes transnational contexts. So David Theo Goldberg, I think in a really good book, writes that racisms have a history of traveling and transforming in their circulation. And this is a slightly more transnational, but not unlike Howard Winant's book, The World is a Ghetto, which explores different forms of racialization around the world after that post-Second World War kind of break in a biological conception of race. And in my own work, this is both shameless self-promotion and how I understand transnationalism. In my own work, my book looks at the political development of racial questions and categories on the national censuses of Canada, the US, and the UK. And I follow in the footsteps of other scholars of black politics and critical race theory and transnationalism and diaspora studies to think about how race is fundamentally transnational. So Omi and Winant define race as a concept that signifies and symbolizes socio-political conflicts and interests in reference to different types of human bodies. But as my friend and political theorist Barner Hesse points out, this reliance on corporality is actually insufficient. Like, if we really believe race is a social construct, then even the reference to different types of bodies, even the reference to the phenotypical and morphological characteristics that we usually associate with race, like hair texture, skin color, eye shape and size, those are part of the construct itself, right? Which means that race isn't about different types of bodies, race is actually about power. And the implications of this is that race is, instead of being in reference to different types of bodies, race is actually more like a set of norms or ideas about how to organize society. There's actually a lot to this claim, which I'd be happy to explain more in the Q&A. Race is not just a free-floating signifier. It's obviously linked to material forces. But one manifestation of race, among others, right? Race can be performative, race can be experiential, but one manifestation of race is as a global idea. Right? Race is born in the transnational realm. It's bred to be central to discourses of modernity, empire, and capitalism. At the same time, race isn't static, and though it's global, it's not uniform. The trans in transnational denotes movement and constant changing. And this is where diaspora and transnationalism studies are actually really helpful. And we all know the work, hopefully, of Paul Gilroy, who uses the metaphor of the Black Atlantic to talk about shared histories and connectivity among African-descended populations. But Brent Hayes Edward points out the necessity of viewing Black cultures in translation, right? Always paying heed to that which can be lost in translation, and always paying heed to those ideas which actually are untranslatable from place to place. So for my work, this led me to ask some questions about the processes by which global ideas are mediated by domestic level institutions. It also led me to wonder about the dynamics of ideational circulation. If transnational ideas shape domestic spheres, then surely the ways in which those ideas get institutionalized in domestic spheres in turn can shape transnational ideas of race as well, right? So diffusion is not just this one-way process from the transnational to the domestic. We also see if there are causal arrows, and there are good reasons to be very suspicious of positivism, they point in many directions, essentially. But I think this is understated in the literature on transnationalism generally. Gilroy, in his original formulation, pointed out that we need to look at both the roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, of racial ideas, and the roots, R-O-O-T-S. So just as the work of transnationalism reveals the constructiveness of borders, I think we need to think about the way that we need to interrogate time and temporality as political constructs themselves. And I think that there are a few dimensions of what Michael Hanchard called racial time that are worth noting. The first is the temporal dimension of racial dynamics, right? So this pertains to the way that time allocation is actually a key element of the power relations that sustain the concept of race. So time management was a key element of slavery, and freedom in part is about having control over one's time, as people who are retired will tell you. And we can also talk about the way that racism actually manifests as unequal temporal access to goods and services. If you don't have a grocery store in your neighborhood, that is your time. that is a direct result of things like segregation and racism. We could also talk about disproportionate incarceration rates as doing time, or literally lost time, the ways that in America, Black life expectancy is cut short. The second way we can think about racial time is the ways that racial dynamics are constituted by peculiar temporal understandings. Anecdote, in 2009, my siblings and I bought my parents a Roomba. It's like one of those little robot vacuums that zoom. I know you all have one, obviously. It zooms around while you're not home and vacuums your house. And so while my parents were pretending to appreciate the gift, for the record, they did not. My brother leaned over to me and said, like, it's 2009, there's a Black president, we bought our parents a robot for Christmas. Like, we're living in a science fiction movie, clearly. Because a Black president used to signify science fiction. It was always Morgan Freeman, right? And it was always kind of denoted that there was some kind of supernatural disaster, like some meteor was about to hit the Earth. But think here, like, what I'm trying to get at is that temporal conceptualizations are really important to our understandings of race. Like, think about, as Sumi Cho points out, like, what do we mean, what does that post in post-racialism mean? What does the post in the post-civil rights era actually mean? How does that fit into a dominant paradigm of linear progress that I think we have really good grounds to critique? Third is what Jack Turner calls political time. I think it's the most interesting, and it is essentially the bifurcation of the past and present. Is the past as we would like to believe? What if the relationship between the past and the present is actually an open political question? What if it is, in fact, a relationship of power? And there are competing interpretations of political time. What does Donald Trump mean when he says, "Make America Great Again"? Another anecdote is I always play this game with my students, and I ask them, if you could live in any time, in any era, in the history of the world, when would you live? And the answer, obviously, is right now, because of dentistry. And if you are a person of color or LGBTQ, the answer is not even right now, like not yet, right? And so the ability to separate the past and the present, the ability to say we need to make America great again, when for some of us it has actually never been great in the first place, it is itself an act of power. So let me put some of this, I am actually on time. Let me put some of this into context with an examination of Canada. If it seems like the theory and the empirical bits are disconnected, it's because they are. I'm still trying to think through some of this. But in the summer of 2016, Black Lives Matter Toronto shut down the Gay Pride Parade, essentially. And they presented the executive directors of Pride with a list of demands, the most controversial of which was that police floats be removed from the parade. And people lost their minds, essentially. Globe and Mail columnist Margaret Wente said that Black Lives Matter is not needed because of the obvious fact that Toronto is one of the most racially peaceable cities in all of North America. We're not Ferguson or anything like it. By pretending Toronto is just another racist hellhole where police routinely gun down Black kids, Black Lives Matter folks do not create a forum for useful discussion, nor do they pay attention to the Black kids who are gunned down by other Black kids. Don't those lives matter too? She calls Black Lives Matter the new bully on the block, a tiny group of noisy activists who borrow their branding and belligerence from the US. The president of the police union said, excuse me, police brutality is an issue for Black Lives Matter in the States. To say we have the same issue in our Canadian policing model, I just totally reject that idea. The numbers don't back it up. The culture doesn't back it up. So these condemnations of Black Lives Matter Toronto are indicative of some key facets about Canadian ideas of race and racism. One, racism existed a long time ago. Racism existed, but a long time ago. Or racism exists, but not here. In some ways, the very existence of Black Lives Matter in places like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver is very, very concerning and controversial to a lot of white Canadians. But the work of Black Lives Matter speaks to some specifically Canadian manifestations of state violence against African-descended populations. In her recent book, Policing Black Lives, Robin Maynard writes that there's a pattern of devaluation of black life in Canada, which includes differential treatment through immigration and criminal justice paradigms, unequal access to employment and housing, and overrepresentation in the child welfare and incarceration systems. Excuse me for a second. Gosh. So these challenges are not unique to Canada, but state violence against Afro-descendant populations is less willingly recognized. Why do we see these limits to the Canadian imagination? One, the dominant cleavage in Canada has always been the French and English conflict. That has been sometimes described in racial terms, most controversially by French-Canadian nationalist Pierre Varet, who argued that the plight of Quebecois in the 1960s was similar to the plight, of African Americans in the U.S. South, totally ignoring that there were actual black people in Canada who had their own plight at the time. Second is the myth of the mosaic. There's an idea that Canada is a mosaic, the U.S. is a melting pot. And in a lot of ways, Canadian national identity is basically being not American, right? And so if racism exists in America, then it can't exist in Canada, because to be Canadian is to be not American. And third, there's a contemporary multicultural discourse, which is really a powerful national ethic in Canada. And the acknowledgement of racism runs counter to this national identity as being a multicultural and tolerant society. So in these ways, Canada reminds me of Anne Laura Stoller's work on colonial aphasia, and I've actually written an article on racial aphasia. But she calls aphasia a dismembering, a difficulty speaking, a difficulty generating a vocabulary that associates appropriate words and concepts with appropriate things, right? So in this way, Canada is a useful and interesting case to explore global racial formations, kind of precisely because the country has this inability to, in fact, speak about race, or to comprehend what is spoken when it is spoken. So I think the task here, oh my God, I only have 5 minutes left. The task here is to kind of look at the way that state violence against African descendant populations exists in Canada, to reimagine the ideas of time, temporality, and territoriality. How do we reconsider Blackness in Canada to illuminate these practices without reproducing the same kinds of comparisons which tend to render it invisible? So I'm running out of time, but quickly, there are various manifestations of state violence in Canada. A couple that I just want to point out. One, there's never been a person of color, any color, on the Supreme Court of Canada, for example. Canadians are vastly underrepresented in all institutions of government. There is incredible overrepresentation in prisons. So the black population of Canada is about 3% of the population, but is 10% of the incarcerated population. Even worse for Indigenous peoples, who are 4% of the Canadian population, but 25% of the incarcerated population. Black people are disproportionately victims of police violence. In Toronto, black people are 8% of the population, but 40% of the victims of deadly police violence. In Winnipeg, Indigenous peoples are 10% of the population, but 65% of the victims of police violence. Of the 461 cases of deadly police interventions, the CBC could recently only find 18 cases where charges have been laid against officers, and to date there are only 2 convictions. But this isn't talked about in the same way that it is in the US. Black Lives Matter has brought to light this really important issue in Toronto, the issue of carding, and whether or not carding is the same as racial profiling. The strategy was initiated in the mid-1990s. It allows officers to stop, question, and document members of the population even when there's been no offense committed. Police don't file cards for every civilian encounter, but only when they want to document a person for intelligence gathering purposes. Personal details are recorded, including name, race, location, and associates. And they're entered into a mysterious database that nobody has access to other than the police, which exists forever, essentially. And the proportion of cards issued for black youth is 3 times greater than the black people's share of the population. And again, this is much higher than like New York City's stop and frisk program when it was at its height, which was a disparity of 2.3%. And in Toronto, we're talking about three times greater. Toronto police deny that it's racial profiling or stop and frisk. But there's a big debate over this kind of recently, in part because of the Toronto Star and their investigative journalism, in part because journalist Desmond Cole wrote an article about how often he, in fact, is stopped by the police. The Toronto Star's analysis revealed that between 2003 and 2008, 41% of all contact cards were about black people. Again, this is a gross overrepresentation. In one year, it was found that there were more cards on black people than there were black people. Is that it? That there were black people in the city. The Toronto created a new policy that was a vast improvement, but the basic point is that police are still permitted to approach, stop, and interrupt individuals as long as they don't try to collect identifying information. The database still exists. Police can still stop black people, but they don't necessarily have it documented now. So in some ways, this policy is even worse. Because with carding, at least we knew the disproportionate numbers. I'm just going to let me skip over here. I'm happy to speak about why I think this is the basic message is that whereas America was founded on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, Canada was founded on peace, order, and good government. And whenever you see the word order, you should always think, do they mean racial order? And usually they do. And in conclusion, let me just say that race has been integral to shaping Canada's national discourse and its nation-building projects. And if we reconsider the role of time and space, I think that we have kind of a more nuanced understanding of racial formations in the Canadian context, and also the ways in which anti-black racism is actually this global system that nevertheless exists with national nuances. Sorry I ran out of time. I have more time on my cell phone. I have 1 more minute according to my cell phone. But I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A. Thank you for your time.
So, Matthias, do you have slides? You don't have.
No,
Okay.
so I apologize.
No.
And I hope you don't mind if I stay here rather than going up to the. Can you hear me like this, or do I need to use the mic? So again, so thank you very much. First of all, to the organizers, Felix and Sunny. Thanks so much as well for the welcome by colleagues and the students from the University of Cincinnati. It really makes such a difference to come to a warm, welcoming space and place. And then also meeting new colleagues, new faces that have been working on issues that we all care about, but also then seeing and being able to spend time again with friends and fellow travelers in a sort of like both like physical, sometimes travelers, but also like metaphorical travelers. So this has been an amazing possibility. So thanks a lot. What I was trying to do in my contribution is going back, I would say go back to the basics, to one of the foundational pieces of critical race theory. And this is Chuck Lawrence's piece, The Id, the Ego, and Equal Protection, Reckoning with Unconscious Racism. And what I try to do in this presentation is try to see what the application of one part of his theoretical aspects in that piece, and where he talks about the cultural meaning test, and apply that and which applications that might have in the mainland European context. So Chuck Lawrence has written this piece in 1987, and it was basically a critique of a US Supreme Court decision, Washington v. Davis, in which the court did essentially 2 things. On the one hand, it required a sort of intent criterion even for disparate impact cases. In Europe, we generally know these cases about indirect discrimination. So when you have a formally neutral provision that has a disparate impact on racial minorities. And here the court said, well, you also will need to have some form of intent in that kind of situation. The other thing is what the court did in that kind of situation is exclude the application of disparate impact in the context of the 14th Amendment. So it did two things, as sort of like a restrictive interpretation, and critical race theorists have looked and analyzed and critiqued heavily the developments that took place from then onwards almost in the jurisprudence by the US Supreme Court in reducing the application of the Civil Rights Act, but also the 14th Amendment. And this is one of the key cases where this kind of development started. So he critiqued this, and he was not the only one, but what he did is basically provide a sort of critical race theory critique. You see that immediately even from the start of the article, where he starts with a long legal long narrative. So methodologically you have that kind of impact as a legal scholar. You read a story first of all before you get to the legal analysis. But then also substantially he did two things, and one is obviously in the title itself. He said, well, what the court doesn't understand is that, that racism often is not a conscious aspect, but that there is a subconscious, unconscious racism, as he talks about, and hence we need to, you misunderstand by putting an intent requirement into disparate impact cases. So this was one aspect. The second part of his critique was also helping develop the court a test whereby you could identify situations that therefore have a racial meaning, and he calls this the cultural meaning test, because he said there's a number of situations where we clearly understand that formally neutral rules nevertheless have a clear racial meaning in the American context. So what happened to this piece has been an incredible success, and I'm really reducing it in the interest of time, reducing the content of it. But what happened to this piece, this has been a very successful piece. It's now still one of the most cited law review articles. And 20 years later, there was a anniversary law review issue on this specific article where Chuck Lawrence intervened and sort of looked at what did they do to my song. And so he said, well, unfortunately, to some extent, what happened here was that the focus had been heavily in scholarship. And he says not in a bad intention, this is not necessarily his point, but the focus had been heavily on this issue of unconscious racism, and in particular on the individual side of it, how racism gets formed in the brain. I mean, there was this whole neuropsychology, kind of almost neurocognitive sort of formation, but at the individual level. And he said, and what partly got kind of forgotten was the cultural meaning test, but also, oh, thank you so much, the cultural meaning test, but also the collective responsibility for these issues of unconscious racism and partly as well of racial formation that take place via such legislation, such seemingly neutral legislation. So he says basically, while they started singing a slightly different song, you could make a parallel with a little bit what Kim Crenshaw talks about when she talks about the Martin Luther King speech, I have a dream. She says, well, we always talk about the dream, but we never talk about that part where there's a promissory note that is also in the speech that we come to cash in Washington. So there's a similar thing going on. We focus on one part, but then we forget a little bit, maybe to some extent, of the more transformative parts of that article. So what I'm trying to do here is looking at this cultural meaning test and how it could apply in the European reality that is to some extent similar, but to some extent different. So interestingly enough, in Europe, a lot of the pickup on Chuck Lawrence's piece has also been on the more unconscious racism part. Partly, if you want to take a positive explanation of that, you might say, well, the cultural meaning test was specifically developed for the US Supreme Court or for American courts. And the reality is as well that in Europe, at least indirect discrimination via the interpretation of the European Court of Human Rights in particular has been broader. There has been a broader interpretation of indirect discrimination or disparate impact, both in terms of scope. So we don't usually use it only in the employment context, but also outside of the employment context. There's a very interesting decision in Biao versus Denmark, where Danish immigration rules have been tweaked in a way and were interpreted as being racially having a disparate racial impact. So we're going really to the core of some of the issues, but outside of the employment domain. So one issue might be, well, at this point, cultural meaning test doesn't necessarily do a lot because disparate impact has been interpreted broadly, also not only in terms of scope, but also in terms of protected grounds. So in Europe, the protection of disparate impact also covers religion, sexual orientation, sex, obviously race, age, disability. So there's been a broader sense of the trajectory, where in the US, the trajectory is sort of a downward trajectory, thanks to the US Supreme Court mostly, whereas in Europe, there has been a sort of expansion. expansion, but I'll get to that in a bit. So that might be the positive explanation. The other one is that also in Europe, the reality is that transformative potential is sometimes forgotten or not liked as much. So in this sense, looking at the reality, so where could this cultural meaning test nevertheless play a role? And I basically identify 3 areas where I believe that in the European reality that might take place, and mostly on the continent. So I developed elsewhere already some studies on the issue that Europe also has its own version of color blindness, like the US. Similar functions in the end, sort of maintain and continue white normativity and domination in a certain way. But again, the elements are slightly different, and I basically stated that these are 2 elements. On the one hand, there's an active elimination of race from legislation. This happens in Germany, in Austria, in France. You can see that very clearly. So taking the word race out of constitutions, out of legislation, to pretend so we're getting rid of that. So there's an active project there. That also takes place in case law to some extent. So we see that taking place in the Conseil Constitutionnel's decision that prohibited the use of race in studies on discrimination. So you see it's sort of like trying to de-race the mainland European context. The other part is that of this element of this colorblindness, European colorblindness, is also the exclusion or construction of the absence of racists. So in some ways, I'm not going to go into the details of the court cases that I was looking at that point, but putting it together in the mainland European context, it becomes extremely difficult to articulate, to make analysis in terms of race. So it's a very difficult reality. So in that context here, then a cultural meaning test, it becomes very difficult then to articulate certain critiques about legislation that has a disparate racial impact, because you're not allowed to talk about race in that context. The cultural meaning test nevertheless would be able to identify legislation that seems quite neutral, and I'm glad that Greg, yesterday you talked about these begging laws, for example, that have been developed in a number of European countries, but also the local level begging ordinances where municipal ordinances were prohibiting certain forms of begging. Those, in most of the cases, have a racial meaning because they mostly target Roma people, especially also in Western European context. I mentioned family reunification legislation, immigration legislation, asylum legislation. All of those have clearly, under the cultural meaning test, you would be able to unearth some of the racial meaning. And to many Europeans, it's relatively clear that when they see certain things, they understand culturally this is about race and ethnicity. So this is one of the examples where I could see the cultural meaning test have an impact even in a different, slightly different reality. The second example that I would like to bring is in France. So France has been sort of par excellence almost the country where this color blindness takes place. A French Republican tradition has eliminated and actively eliminated the word race and rejected that kind of reading. But at the same time, what has recently been seeing is that there's a development of anti-discrimination grounds. France has had a sort of like almost like bulimia of anti-discrimination legislation and inventing different grounds of discrimination. So at the moment today, we have 25 different prohibited grounds of discrimination in France. Now, once you start looking at these different grounds, you'll find certain things, and they're very worried. There was a conference 2 months ago on the multiplication of criteria of discrimination. What does this mean? So it seems to be that France is picking up on it and actively following it, but you could say that actually dilutes a number of things. But when you start looking at these different grounds, you find it's prohibited to discriminate on the grounds of the place of residence, the capacity to express oneself in a language other than French, the family name, to discriminate on the basis of banking information and of origins. I mean, the one that is clearly has a racial cultural meaning is the last one, but the other ones, you know, if you're thinking about banking information, like what the heck does that have to do with race? Or have a cultural meaning that is related to race? Well, it's very simple that in certain situations where by the banking information you find out where people are living. Hence, you find out that this person lives in this neighborhood, and we had this joke yesterday at some point with bad neighborhoods or not, but that there is a racial meaning then tied to that, and or that if your banking information comes from the former colonies, from some of the islands, Martinique, Guadeloupe, you might be discriminated against and not get a job. So they invented these criteria, but basically to not mention race. So you're creating new ones that stand in as proxies for race. And here again, I think the cultural meaning test could do some work in actually helping the French legislator actually getting rid of those and naming for what they are. The last point, and I'm trying to be quick here, very aware of those tickets there. The last point is basically the last example that I would like to give. There's a number of cases, and here I'm taking cue of the case law developed by the Court of Justice of the European Union, mostly in interpreting the Race Equality Directive. That has been the main instrument by which the EU has been trying to fight race discrimination. Substantially over the 10 years that this directive has been in place, there have been 3 substantive judgments on the interpretation of that. One has been framed as victimless discrimination. This was a Belgian case, Ferrin, where an employer, potential employer, made statements, I'm not going to hire any immigrants. No one stepped forward to bring a claim, actually, so this was picked up by an NGO, but that was framed as a case of victimless discrimination. Second case was one about a Bulgarian practice by the Bulgarian electricity companies, ČEZ, and the claim was brought by a non-Romani white Bulgarian woman who had a store in a Romani neighborhood where this electricity company was hanging up electricity meters at 7 meters height. The rationale for that was, well, in those neighborhoods there's tinkering with the electricity meters, hence we don't want people to get access to them. She brought a claim, but again, you see what the problem is, that this case, in the end, it was found as being discriminatory by association, but this was, again, a white plaintiff. On top of that, she was not happy to be associated with Roma people. So you see what happened here. The last one, Huskic, was about a Bosnian man in Denmark that had to provide additional documents as opposed to other Danish citizens for getting a mortgage or a driver's license. I don't remember, one of the two. So 3 cases, very few of them compared to the whole plethora of forms of racism existing in Europe. And when you look at the other not substantial cases of the Court of Justice of the European Union, the procedural ones, there's one, Galina Meister, that was brought by a white Russian, or German, but of Russian, but of German origins back in the 200 years before, who claimed race discrimination for language discrimination. And the other case, Runewicz Vardin, was a transcription of Polish or Lithuanian kind of language names into the registry of Lithuania or of Poland, vice versa. So, but again, white plaintiffs, and you're thinking here, where is the racial meaning in these cases? And this is partly what I'm trying to do, and Chuck Lawrence in his piece as well said, well, on the one hand, I'm broadening the scope, obviously, with disparate impact and asking the court to use a cultural meaning test to understand what race is and what racism is. But on the other hand, I'm also narrowing it down to some extent because not everything is race. So he brings the argument of a bridge poll tax. He says that doesn't necessarily have a racial meaning, cultural meaning in the US, but zoning laws do. So he says, on the one hand, it opens up because, yes, we do want to see the impact, but for other things, it doesn't. And in a similar way, in the European context, I think this is where we could see that, on the one hand, it would broaden and apply race discrimination to seemingly neutral laws, but where many Europeans do understand that this has clearly racial meaning. But in other situations, and I'm talking here about cases, there's been a case in some of these cases like Galina Meister or Runewicz Vardin, there is no racial cultural meaning there in those specific cases. So we might be able to separate the wheat from the chaff by using such a cultural meaning test. Last example that I want to bring in these is in Germany, there's been some discussion about East Germans bringing cases of race discrimination because they're Eastern German and not Western German. So, or in Italy, Southern Italians bringing claims of race discrimination because they're Southern Italians and Northern Italians. So here again, I think the cultural meaning test would help us. I'm not saying that functionally there are similar mechanisms of exclusion taking place, but they're not taking place on the basis of the race of these people. So again, the cultural meaning test would help us to identify and separate wheat from the chaff and actually make sure that we call things when they are racism, and in other situations we might be able to call them differently. But these cases that have been coming up in Europe, that using such a cultural meaning test might help us understanding in that reality better what is race and the paradigmatic forms of racism that Europe has, anti-black racism, anti-Gypsyism, anti-Semitism, obviously, and Islamophobia, and that we might be able to separate one thing from the other, and these other cases that come up, frame them certainly as problematic, but not as specifically as race discrimination. So again, like Chuck Lawrence would say, not everything was race, but with such a cultural meaning test and understanding, we would be able to identify situations, even in the disparate impact context, where we identify the real forms of racism. So this is, I hope I've done my talk in time.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Group. Great. Thank you. Jengis, the pressure is on.
Yes. Just a second.
Yep.
Well, first of all, let me just say that how grateful I am for being here. Thank you to the organizers for having me here. As Matthias already said, it's really nice being here, having friends, colleagues, and new friends and colleagues since yesterday. And actually, I used to speak free as well during my talks, but this time I'm a little bit twisted because I really did my homework and prepared some paper and I want to read it. Although I would love to give a lot of answers to Matthias' thought-provoking ideas about especially the European context. And no need to say, Deborah's talk already anticipated many things what I want to touch upon. Maybe just I'll start and then you'll say when I should speak free and I should just switch to the other mode. To frame race and law in Germany and in Europe involves a set of basic questions. What is race? What is law? What is Germany? And what is Germany in Europe? The real challenge is to elaborate on the historical, epistemological, sociological, and legal connections among these three questions without equating or reducing race to racism, without reifying law as a monolithic field, and without homogenizing Europe. These themes deserve their own in-depth analysis, although one must always bear in mind that there are no quick and easy answers to such controversial and complex issues. I will explore these questions from an interdisciplinary and practical perspective. In doing so, I am particularly interested in reframing the way we think and analyze race and law in Europe and Germany in order to promote effective legal protection against racial discrimination and other related forms of discrimination. I will conclude my thoughts with a critical assessment of what I identify as the post-Holocaust ideology of German exceptionalism, which makes it impossible to understand the concept of Rasse, I'm purposely saying it in German, as a social construct and thus make it useful for non-discrimination law. What is race, or race does not equate to racism? Today, German race scholarship agrees on the axiomatic phrase race is a social construct. While it is not particularly enlightening or inspiring to point out that race, like gender, ethnicity, color, etc., is a social construct, still a little in-depth knowledge has been produced on what the constructedness of race really means and how race operates in everyday life in Germany. This is particularly the case for scholarship on racism, migration, gender, and most importantly, intersectionality in the German context. Furthermore, does the social constructedness of race imply that there is no materiality to race at all? Or is this so-called materiality already embedded in a socially constructed world? Question mark. These questions obviously could provoke different answers according to the discipline in which you challenge them. For a biologist, race has been a very contentious category for classifying human groups or ranking them in terms of superiority. Even though scientific research in genetics provide compelling evidence that there is no genetic or biological basis for race, the medical discourse, to make connection to the talk yesterday, the medical discourse continues to call for race-conscious healthcare to accommodate the health issues for certain racial groups who suffer from significantly more than other groups. No doubt, racism, a system of exclusion and oppression, historically has had an adverse impact on the health conditions of people who have been affected by it, but to what extent is it really relevant and necessary to use the racial frame in the health sector? One could argue that, in the long run, promoting a race-blind healthcare or legal system may cause more harm than bringing advancement to the health situation of racial groups. This consideration shows that not every reference to or use of race necessarily implicates racism. Thus, equating race with racism is a sinful mistake made by many German scholars, activists, lawyers, and policymakers who are not aware of the profound social meaning of race. One could call this conduct the racial deadlock, that is, race only does bad things. This is the very mechanism which takes place when German and French policymakers demand that the term race be banned from the Constitution altogether, Article 3 in the case of German Constitution. Another example that shows that not every reference to race implicates racism can be found in identity politics. Calling oneself black and promoting black politics is performing racial identity politics, which manifestly reinforces race as a performative social category. Black is a political identity, yes, but also a racial one. No one would accuse a black organization of perpetuating racist self-identification because they foreground blackness. In return, to call or describe a person as white is not a racist marker, but a race-conscious designation of certain privileges. Here, it becomes clear that the distinction between race and racism is more crucial than ever. The racial deadlock can go so far in the German context, can go so far as official bodies such as the Federal Agency for Non-Discrimination, the Antidiskriminierungsstelle des Bundes, systematically avoid the notion of race, even though the legal framework of the agency includes race. The agency only uses the notion ethnic origin or even only origin, which certainly does not include race. Since blacks have been constructed as racial rather than an ethnic group, it is hardly convincing to classify the form of discrimination they suffer as ethnic discrimination. In other words, ethnicity, be it in non-discrimination law or in social science, should not be seen in a dichotomous relation to race. Moreover, and in many cases, race and ethnicity are not even separable or they can converge. For instance, a black German with Algerian descent. Which is why the EU Race Directive contains racial and ethnic origin in order to secure legal protection against any form of racial and ethnic discrimination. The International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination of 1965 is an example of an older legal framework that rests on an understanding of race as a multi-layered concept. Article 1 states that racial discrimination is to be understood as any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, national origin, and ethnic origin. So I'm not going to read the whole definition of racial discrimination. Strikingly, the ICERT, the Convention, and the EU Race Directive have been characterized as, in German, Anti-Rassismus-Konvention, Anti-Racism Convention, and the Race Directive as Anti-Rassismus-Richtlinie, the Anti-Racism Directive. Here again, one can observe that race has become racism, or in this case, anti-racism, in the German-speaking context. This lost in translation is all but accidental. It is, in fact, paradigmatic of the racial deadlock. Race and law, and also in the context of German law. These observations lead us to the question, what does race mean for and in the law? Answering this question unavoidably provokes a discussion about the historical entanglement of race and law, colonialism, slavery, apartheid, National Socialist law, and the implementation of these legal regimes by their respective courts have played a major role in defining not only who is white or Jew, but also in dehumanizing those people on the wrong end of the various classification systems. Today, however, race meets law only in non-discrimination law in Germany. The exception of Article 116 of the German Constitution, according to which any expatriation during between 33 and 45 is void, and therefore former German citizens can apply for German citizenship. This is the case for especially for Israeli citizens do take this a lot, use this option. So today, however, race meets law only in non-discrimination law. Opponents of race argue that the legal term race upholds the idea that biological races exist. Oddly, the same argument about skin color is not made. Some legal scholars even argue that race should be replaced by color. But isn't color the most prominent identifier indicator of race? And yet, color is just as much as of a social construct. What about other grounds of discrimination, such as ethnicity, nationality, sex, and disability, which are no less social and historical constructs, and consequently by no means less problematic than race? To reflect on the ambiguity of race and other grounds of discrimination is not to reject them or to go beyond them, as the advocates of the so-called post-categorical approach have been promoting recently. Maybe I can come in the Q&A to that, what post-categorical means. The post-categorical approach, to maybe to drop one line, sees the categories as a problem of non-discrimination law, not as a solution. Therefore, racism should be defined in non-discrimination law, not race as the answer on that. In a highly racialized and gendered world, there can be no beyond race. Race blindness per se is utopian. Post-racialism, however tempting, remains delusive. These questions and observations reveal the analytical weakness of the anti-race discourse. Such a discourse is harmful to the anti-racist struggle because it does not differentiate between law against race discrimination and race discrimination through law. Additionally, it is at odds with the non-discrimination legal framework and is inconsistent with the characteristics and dynamics of legal texts, respectively. Legal terms can be interpreted through a wide range of methods of interpretation, including grammatical, contextual, historical, and teleological. Law is indeterminate. This is what we have learned from the crits. The law is used to dealing with concepts that lack clear content and which must be substantiated through interpretation. Finally, can reasonable and effective affirmative action policies circumvent the concept of race, gender, religion, ethnicity, or nationality? In fact, racial, ethnic, or gender-based affirmative action measures are compelling examples of the constructive use of race, ethnicity, and gender to make distinctions while, at the same time, not promoting racism or sexism. On the contrary, race-sensitive measures are not equal to essentialist and or racist policies, as it is often assumed in German legal discourse, be it progressive or conservative discourse. As such, racial and or ethnic data are much needed to measure structural racial discrimination and particularly to prove disparate impact. The newly founded Center for Intersectional Justice based in Berlin and acting throughout Europe can be regarded as an example of best practice in how to advocate for retaining race, gender, religion, sexuality, and ethnicity in all their complexity for practical use. My conclusions: race and law in Germany and in Europe. After having discussed race and its constitutive relation to law in general and to German law in particular, it becomes essential to locate race and law in time and space. Race is not an abstract concept. It is rather genuinely contingent. Race in North America differs from race in South America, and race in Europe is not identical to race in Africa. Therefore, it is necessary to contextualize and compare race. Establishing contrast and difference, however, cannot be the sole goal of comparative approach, as it is often the case in German and more broadly in European scholarship. It is far more insightful to elaborate on the commonalities and relationalities of race, a word from David Goldberg. The relationality of race and racial discourses between various racial contexts. Bearing the contingency and the varying semantics of race in mind, race critique in Germany therefore cannot avoid the term Rasse. Talking about race in Germany for sure takes place in a post-Holocaust context, where major concerns about the usage of the term Rasse are understandable. Rasse is what the Nazis did, is the narrative. But from an analytical and legal domestic European and international law point of view, Rasse is unavoidable. Therefore, putting Rasse in quotation marks, using the English notion race, or replacing it with color, ethnicity, or racism simply gives us a reprieve from the real work to be done, which is race-conscious legal thinking and reasoning. A race-conscious thinking in Europe, and specifically in Germany, needs to link the post-Holocaust with the post-colonial context in order to relocate Rasse in a global and local context. Doing so, German exceptionalism, that is the hegemonic idea that because of the exceptional German past, today the German context needs to be regarded as exceptional. In the German context, German racism, and therefore German Rasse, is considered a universal, vicious, exceptional phenomenon that is incomparable to any other racial formation. In this view, it is even hard to point out to everyday and structural racism, because the narration goes like, racism is what the Nazis did. Today's affective and moral economies of the post-Holocaust makes it impossible to deepen the understanding of Rasse as a social construct, because in German exceptionalism, Rasse is deemed to be inherently negative. This atomic, isolated and provincial understanding of Rasse and German racism needs to be de-provincialized and revisited. Thank you.
Thank you. Three really great papers, presentations. Before taking Q&A from the audience, I actually wanted to see if the panelists had questions for each other that they wanted to talk about to start the conversation.
I leave space to the
I feel like I've talked to Okay. Well, I have some questions, but I want to open it up. We have about 15 minutes left for Q&A. So, are there?
Yeah, my question's about how you think about producing knowledge in this environment. Everyone in some way kind of talked about how this society and we in it just fundamentally can't see, think, or perceive racism. And so when you're producing knowledge that's critical of that, and it's the Chuck Lawrence quote, "What did they do to my song?" I guess when you're producing this knowledge, are you just trying to make your best song and put it out there, or are you also trying to anticipate how this machine will dilute your knowledge or dilute your message? How are you thinking about navigating the process of denial itself while you're writing?
I would like to start.
Yeah,
with that,
sure.
actually. I have had harsh times in Germany as one of the first voices who started to say loudly that we need race. Because the whole discourse in Germany, including some NGOs, and even some NGOs of color, and even the biggest black association in Germany, was promoting to ban race, to remove race from the law. So, and these are all friends of mine, of us, and we're all working together on other projects. And it is hard, first of all, to place a scholarly article in a journal. And I needed a couple of attempts. Towards the end, someone really, just to quote a white male professor who considered himself as being of the '68 generation in Germany, said, like in a very paternalist way, "My son, it's very hard for someone from my generation to digest what you're saying here about Rasse, but in a way you convinced me." So, so it can work. It can work. But to come back to your question is the discourse on the anti-race discourse, how I call it, is a very powerful discourse because it is connected. It connects politics with legal practice and with activism, and so people around in this room who are familiar with the German context, they might know how hard it is to get through it, that it's a very marginal position. And I think that's a very provincial understanding of the German context, and we need to anticipate on this global perspective of race, that race was never only in Germany and never only in the States. It always traveled. And the exceptionality about Germany is, and I guess in race scholarship as well, there are three paradigms, I would say. North America, segregation; South Africa, apartheid; and National Socialism as racial extermination. And it is very pity that not a lot of connections are made between these paradigms, I would say. And that's one of the biggest failures, especially from German perspective, I think.
Let me just say something really quickly. So I think about this a lot because I'm a political scientist. I'm a reluctant political scientist, but I am a political, that's my training. We often get accused, those of us who do more critical work, of doing like me-search instead of research. But my response to that is always like, you don't have to believe me. Like, there's data. There's a ton of data. There are a ton of studies. Like, if you don't believe that racism exists in Canada, let me show you the data on disparate incarceration rates, right? Like, and so I think that for me, the aim is always to produce scholarship that adds to this body of empirical data that demonstrates the reality of race and racism. Because frankly, like, the challenge in Canada and to a lesser extent in the US, but certainly in Europe, is the collection of good data and good, like, subsequent analytical studies that help demonstrate our points. But like, I'm not making this up, right? Like I can point you to the wealth of, no, this is why I don't engage in debates on Twitter, right? Because people on Twitter are like, you know, don't believe you when you point to actual studies. But for me, like, this is how to navigate the process of denial is like, I don't need to prove this to you. There are lots of studies that demonstrate this exact point. There are way more studies on our side than there are on the other side, because we actually have empirical data to back up this.
But it's also very typical that in liberal discourses, right, this whole me-search,
Yeah.
like only you're doing me-search. The rest, everybody else is not doing
Yeah.
me-search. They're doing objective research, you know,
Yeah.
which is a complete fallacy, right?
Yeah,
So,
totally. Yeah.
yeah.
Matthias?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. In some ways, the risk that I see happening is, and just as a side note, obviously as a white man, the me-search question doesn't often come up when you're doing like, but you find yourself in different binds when you're standing in front of a French class and you have people that are black or of Arabic origins, and there you stand and you're saying, you know, the problem with France is that it's not having a race-conscious approach and race needs to be brought back in. And then you have your black students raising their hands and like, you know, this is not I'm a Republican French. And so there you stand as a white man sort of saying, you know, this is what should be done. I'm not saying, you know, I know all about, you know, what that means, but you find yourself in a slightly different position. But to get back to your question, the risk is in particular in France is that one of the things that you get is this gets too close. This race-conscious approach is basically what Marine Le Pen is advocating. This is what maybe Orban might be advocating, that you have all of a sudden the song is being picked up, but at a completely different space than you want to have it. And sort of like that you're saying that all of a sudden it's, well, yes, we are all about whiteness and white supremacy. So that these are kind of the situation that Marine Le Pen is all about. Yes, we always said there's race. We always said this. And that all of a sudden you find yourself much closer to those people with advocating for a race-conscious approach and bringing that word back in, I mean, in the sense that it was never gone, in my opinion, but making it come out in much clearer way. And then all of a sudden, your work becomes helpful and conducive to that kind of political constituency. And that is the broader risk that I can see, and that the message is then that you need to make sure and separate that it's not the same, that you're not advocating for that kind of race consciousness, but for a very different one. And that should come through in very clear ways. And the risk, the political risk, at least in the European context, is that with that kind of reality coming up, you find yourself on a very different spectrum. So we need to be very clear with those messages, because that's the last thing that we want, that our words get kind of excerpted and put into the mouth of Marine Le Pen or Viktor Orban or of similar kind of politicians. So that, I think, is sort of the risk that definitely is there.
Your comments just now really made me think about the ways in which critical race theory itself and some of its insights have often been misused, not perhaps in quite in the same way, but I was wondering, given the sort of similar ascendancies of nativist and anti-immigrant discourses and interventions, how those are interpreted as non-racial, and whether or not they occupy a sort of different register. That is to say, how are those kinds of politics sort of understood and discussed? And the reason I'm asking is to think about how Islamophobia, et cetera, and others is sort of, I guess it's a cleanse of its racial dimensions. Obviously, there's a similar kind of dynamic here. It's just not considered race, right? But I wonder if it's possible for you to say something about how those discourses are, in what register are they sort of understood or discussed?
So was that question, I guess, somehow I feel interpolated. So I think in particular in France, I mean, one of the things is I think there's a much more sort of almost decomplexed use by the political right in saying this is, we say this is about race, you know, and whites have been, that there's a very sort of openness about certain political situation. Maybe then there's nuances on which groups we're talking about, because there's the difficulty of this exclusive reading that Chang said for Germany, but also for most of the mainland European countries that think about race in terms of Holocaust and anti-Semitism. So there seems to be still some sort of, okay, we need to be careful about that. But anti-Gypsyism, anti-black racism, and colonialism, that is sort of the aphasia that, Deborah, that you were talking about. So in those contexts, saying that, yes, you know, there is a sort of value in white, sort of relevance of white, and talking in those racial terms is not even considered to be a problem. The problem is then the colorblindness of the situation as well of French republicanism, where the difficulty of articulating things, and this links it to the question of Islamophobia, because race is read almost exclusively as anti-Semitism, at least in the mainland European context. Anything else is not race, is something else. So with Islamophobia, it's religion, mainly, to some extent. So then you quickly find a different bucket where to put it into so as to eliminate the racial underpinnings of Islamophobia in the European context. So there's all these ways of, and you said it very nicely in Canada, I thought this is exactly the same thing that happens in Europe with displacing things into somewhere else. So colonialism happened in Africa, it didn't happen here. We never had slavery in Europe on the mainland. I mean, that's the forgetting about the enslavement of Roma in parts of Eastern Europe. So there's all these displacements in time, displacements of geography that take place that then render it possible to not being able to talk about race. But then comes this sort of, you know, this appropriation of a right-wing national nativism, you said as well, that picks that up in very open ways and non-complexified ways, and all of a sudden you find yourself on that spectrum against the French Republican, colorblind, or German sort of approach of, well, you know, we're not using race because that harks back to that time. And all of a sudden you find yourself at the other end of the spectrum with people who speak openly and say, like, yeah, we've always said the same thing as you're saying. So that is the, I think, I'm not sure that it really answers your question, but at least some of the dynamics that are taking place at the moment.
Yeah, I think so. I think I was really interested in just sort of picking up not so much on the sort of right-wing assertion of a kind of racist or nativist position, but how does resistance to that position articulate itself? In other words, what is the pushback against those forms of racism from, say, a group that would not identify itself with the right?
can I say something about that? So I think that it's really interesting because, I'm listening to you guys and it makes me think of, so we're in a moment where we're assuming transcendence, right, in post-racialism, but also that what is being affected is once again, a leveling of that playing field of, race is race, and it's all, racial classifications are all racist, right? But, what I haven't heard is just white supremacy, that these racial classifications are in service to white supremacy, and so when these, when Marie Le Pen talks about whiteness as sort of like, yes, we're talking about race, it's in service to a very different thing than what like Black Lives Matter is talking about, right? And I think, if you kind of recognize those phases in post-racialism, you can kind of see that very clearly.
Yeah, I think Cheryl, I think your question is really good because I think that it brings back like this fundamental issue of power, right? Like because I wrote this article a few years ago about the manifestation of emotions in politics, and I was particularly interested in like why is it that like Black Lives Matter is seen as angry, where like white male anger gets normalized in American politics all the time? And the answer is that liberal democratic projects like accept and normalize when certain people speak emotionally, and it sees as aberrations when others do, right? And that's like built into the fabric of liberalism and democracy, I argue, and so I think that the real question for me that Black Lives Matter raises is like, is there a transformative potential within the project of liberal democracy given the ways in which power relationships like immediately exclude voices and include others automatically? And my answer to that is like, no, right? We need to think of a different kind of radical project that blows up like these ideas that are intrinsic to liberalism and democracy. And I say that to my students and they're like, oh, and the analogy I give to them is like, look, you're going to a party and you're excluded from the party, but then you find out at this party, people are being like roofied. Is that the party you want to go to? Like, is this the party we want to join? Do we want to join? Do we want to be included in this liberal democratic project? Or do we want to create something different? And that's my answer, right? Is that like we actually need to think a lot more radically, given the limits of liberal democracy. We need to think more radically about what we might build that can be fundamentally different.
Maybe as a sort of follow up, and to resist the temptation of the symmetrical reading of what has been done with equality and bringing in the power dimensions. And there is a trend as well in recognizing anti-white racism in the European context. France and Germany has been very prominent on that. And again, to show that this is not the same, that what is going on, if the victim of a racist attack is a racial minority, it's not the same than when that happens the other way around. The courts, unfortunately, have not been very good at that, but that we need to make sure that there's asymmetry in the protection due to the different power, representational and positions of whites in Europe and racial minorities. And hence that is sort of, I think, where the nuances are being brought in terms of distinguishing my position or a CRT Europe position from those of Marine Le Pen and all of that. So that brings in part of the links of linking. One is the result of white supremacy, and the other one comes from a very different space and reality. So I think that is this symmetrical risk is there.
Cheryl, let me just give very quick, concrete examples in order to try to answer on your question. The resistance. The Jewish community defines itself in Germany as a religious community, not as a racial community. According to UK law, Jews are a racial group. And when you ask them, so is anti-Semitism a form of racism? Yes. So is this, then what is it? Is it based on the religion solely? No. Then what else? Then you feel that there is a deadlock there, that the vocabulary is not there or purposely not taken advantage of. With respect to Islamophobia, I know a doctoral student whose basic tenet for her PhD is the current anti-Muslim discourses, in the current anti-Muslim discourses, religion is race. So it's all about race, how a very specific group is racialized, and religion, and Islam in this case, is used as a proxy. Muslims today are characterized as misogynist, as homophobic, as anti-democratic, as terrorist, and the latest version of that is being as inherently anti-Semitic. And we especially have this discourse since the refugee crisis in the last 1 or 2 years. The very sad thing happened just a couple of days ago, where the president of the Jewish community, the federal Jewish community, made a proposal that maybe in case of Muslims, we should change the presumption of innocence, that Muslims should maybe prove that they are not anti-Semitic. So also between communities, there are a lot of tensions going on among communities. And what we call today Muslims were called the day before guest workers and migrants. And so, and the race travels and it decodes itself again and again. So I hope that was like a very short picture, and I haven't touched about the issue of Roma in Germany. They are suffering at the most in the shadow of the Jewish community in the whole post-Holocaust discourse. It is the way how they are deported. We have seen the movie yesterday, and I would argue that, so I just started to mention actually German exceptionalism, but German exceptionalism, that's where the story starts. German exceptionalism is for me a white German narrative. So it is reforming actually Germany as a white nation, as a white German nation, where actually a very essential identity politics occur, which is we, because of our past, the we is the white German subject, having grandparents who were Nazi, and that's where the morality comes from, where the moral economy comes from, because we have been there today, and because we have come to our we have dealt with our past, we know today how to deal with these issues, and that's not to talk about it.
So I know that there were other questions that's really interesting, but we're now late over time. So we have about 10 minutes for the break, and I really encourage you to ask questions during the break and to continue these conversations during the break. Thank you so much for 3 excellent